Hi, welcome. This is Jim Ruff, and I have here as a guest on my show today an old friend, Mike Murray, who is someone who's very important to me, and he's also a computer pioneer. I call him, he calls him a veteran, a computer veteran, I guess, but someone who's been involved in Apple Computer in the early stages and in Microsoft in the early stages. And now he is, I guess you call it, retired, and is a social entrepreneur and friend of humanity, I think is another way to say it. And also 97.8% water, which is Mike's been making that point as well. So, Mike, tell us what you're here to tell us. No, I don't mean to be funny that way, but you started out with where you and I left. You and I were good buddies at Simpson Timber Company, and then you left to go to Stanford Business School, and then you began working as the marketing manager for the Macintosh computers at Apple Computer.
Yeah, going back in that part of history, I was at Stanford for a couple of years getting an MBA, and towards the end of that experience, you go through a formal interviewing process, and there were lots of large New York-based banks, investment companies, and Fortune 500 companies all interviewing at the MBA program. And I'd go in and listen to these organizations give their presentations, and I thought I'd probably made the worst mistake in my life, having just spent 2 years getting this great education and thinking, this is where I'm supposed to go. And then, I just couldn't picture myself in that type of a formal and very structured and very traditional work environment. One day, a young guy shows up, and and I thought he was a student, but he went down to the front of the presentation room at lunchtime to talk about his organization, and he had on jeans and a vest, a down vest, and he starts talking about his company and how they're in the process of changing the world. And this was a guy named Steve Jobs, and his company was Apple Computer. And I usually sat in the back of the room with a newspaper because these presentations I had to work pretty hard to get my attention, and I immediately put my paper down and started listening to him. And he talked about how a new kind of a computer called a personal computer was going to revolutionize not only the way people viewed technology, but the way people used technology. And he said a lot of things that I found extremely interesting. And prior to receiving an MBA, and early on I received an engineering degree, and I was interested in the way things work and in technology as it was in those days. So I cut classes that day and went home in the afternoon and called up Apple Computer because I wanted to talk to this guy. And they'd already been in business for about 5 years, but they were still pretty small. And I didn't get to talk to him, but I talked to his secretary, and I told her I needed I wanted to work there. And through a long series of conversations and tenacity and so forth, eventually I did end up working for Steve Jobs, and it ended up being just an extraordinary experience in the early days of the Macintosh project, which is what I was involved in. In those days, we referred to what we were doing as the democratization of technology. And those were very idealistic terms, but we really, those of us involved in the project, and the core group of about 20 of us at the time, really believed that. We believed that technology could become a tool for accessing information, for sharing knowledge, for enhancing creativity, expanding, or maybe reducing the size of the world. And this was the process of the democratization of technology. And there was a great deal of idealism thrust forth in that project. And to me, that was a very meaningful experience. It was also a fairly wild and crazy experience, given the work environment, the kinds of people we were working with, the challenges that we had, the youth. We were quite young at the time. But it was something that I really treasure as I look back and at some of the very interesting and almost serendipitous work experiences that I've had.
Yeah, well, you brought me in as a consultant for a brief moment, so I had a window to look at that, and it was something I'll never forget. I remember, first of all, you had the Wall Street Journal calling on one phone, and the New York Times calling on the other phone. It was a very exciting time, and you were the head of marketing for the Macintosh, is that right?
Yeah, that was my job, was to figure out how to get people, meaning millions and millions of people around the world, to first of all learn this new vocabulary word, Macintosh, and then try to figure out what it meant, and then decide that they were probably had made a mistake since they hadn't bought one yet. So we wanted to create this great demand throughout the world that people, in order to be able to consider yourself an appropriate human being, you needed to have a Macintosh. So our job was to just create mass demand for this product, which at the time was quite expensive compared to what computers are today. I think the thing we had going for us was that we didn't know any better. we just simply didn't. And if we would have gone into a project like that now, and as we're in our middle age, we would have put all kinds of conceptual constraints around ourselves, because all those typical things you hear that, oh, you can't do that, we would have imposed those on ourselves. And back then we didn't know.
Yeah. And I remember the joke. I mean, I don't remember the joke, but it was something like, how do you tell if there's an Apple business meeting going on, something about there needing to be a Boy Scout leader or something like that.
The company did lack a lot of adult supervision in those days, and it was remarkable that we were able to get done what we did get done.
Yeah. And how old were you when you had this?
I was in my late 20s.
Yeah.
Uh-huh.
And one of the things that you did, which is nationally quite famous, is the I think I don't know what the awards were, but the famous ad that ran once in 1984 at the Super Bowl that ushered in the Macintosh. Maybe you could tell us a little about that.
Well, we needed the Macintosh was introduced as a product in January of 1984, and prior to that time, Apple had not had a lot of success in introducing totally new kinds of computers. The year before, they introduced a product that most people have never heard of called the Lisa. It failed. All the market research at the time showed that IBM was just going to completely clean up in this marketplace. They'd already been in the market for 3 years. They had a giant market share, and they were doing very well with a good product. The Macintosh was totally different, and yet it lacked good software. It didn't have a color screen. It didn't have a hard disk drive, and it was going to come, and yet we wanted people to believe they needed one. So we had to create a new kind of marketing, and we essentially invented the way technology products are now regularly introduced and marketed. And that's with a great big event, that's with a lot of excitement, that's with a lot of noise. And what you're trying to do is get people to lift their heads out of their newspapers and say, what was that? What's going on? So our goal there was to buy advertising space or TV time in the Super Bowl and run a very unusual and let's call it arresting TV commercial. When we showed this commercial ahead of time to the Apple Board of Directors, they insisted that we never show it again to anybody ever, and insisted that we sell the time that we had on the Super Bowl. And I thought I probably was going to get fired the next day, so we instructed our advertising agency to sell the time. And we actually had, we'd purchased a 60-second commercial and a 30-second commercial. And they were able to sell the 30-second time slot to somebody else, probably for razor blades or beer or something. But the deadline came and went, and they called me. They were in New York, and they called me down in California and said, I'm sorry, but we've been unable to sell that 60-second spot. And to this day, I've never asked them how hard they really tried, because they loved the commercial. I loved the commercial. So it was better left unevaluated. And then the board of directors said, well, what other commercials do we have? Do we have anything worthwhile showing? And luckily we didn't. So we were forced to show this commercial one time in the Super Bowl, and it ended up being so different and so arresting that it was then repetitively shown on all the major TV stations in terms of news in those days, which was CBS, ABC, and NBC, and they kept showing this commercial over and over again on the news shows, which is exactly what you want, because what we understood very well was that Americans and everyone hates being duped or hates being forced into a position of saying, this is what you're going to believe. But on the other hand, if they think something is news, well, news means it's been objectively vetted, and people are saying, this is real stuff. You ought to pay attention to this. So one of our second-level goals was to have the introduction of the Macintosh become news, so it wasn't public relations. Well, sure enough, they just gobbled this thing up. So here we were on all the news, and then because it was on the TV news, then all the major newspapers and all the major magazines had to follow suit. So soon after it being on the news, we were on the front page of the New York Times and Wall Street Journal and USA Today, and then we became literally front cover of Time Magazine, Newsweek, Fortune, Forbes, Business Week, And we were just this huge thing had happened with this bunch of 20-something-year-old kids out in California acting like we knew what we were doing. So that in and of itself taught me huge lessons about how one can work with this giant, what do we sometimes call it, the fourth estate, the media, and have it work to your advantage in terms, if you have something that's a good story to tell.
So did you recover from that? I mean, did these people that maybe wanted you to fire you or whatever, it seemed like you had a big slam dunk win. I'm curious as to...
Well, there's a great saying that hindsight is 20/20. I actually
Yeah.
think it's more like 20/40. When you're able to see something after the fact, you're able to really read the fine print and so forth. So the next time we had there was a board meeting, they asked our team to come in there, and as we came in, they actually stood up and gave us a standing ovation. So I'm not sure when they were smarter, if they were smarter before, when the first time they saw it,
Yeah.
or after they saw the public reaction. I would say there was a lot of serendipity in play there, and we hit something that was a nerve in the country that was very, very viable, and that was this notion of Big Brother, 1984, playing off the book by Orwell. The year was 1984. The theme of the commercial talked about Big Brother and Big Brother usurping your ability to choose for yourself what you want. So there was a lot of good energy that we were able to just tap into, and it was a rather outrageous commercial at the time. So,
Yeah.
so it worked, and we were lucky.
That was
A
neat.
year later, the story we never get to tell was a year later we had another very arresting commercial in the Super Bowl, and it was a complete flop. And it was called the Lemmings commercial, and it just didn't work at all.
Hmm.
So sometimes you get it right, sometimes you don't.
Interesting. So then you left Apple. I guess you left just before or right about when Steve Jobs left.
Steve Jobs got fired, and as a result of that, those who were associated very closely with him were no longer enjoyed by the company.
Wow. Yeah.
So the party was over, and it took a little while for some of us to understand that. But then I left 3 or 4 months after Steve got fired.
And then you went back
Yep.
east, and I forgot.
Well,
what
then
happened
I
in the
was just
middle.
involved. I went to another computer company and was involved in helping them buy different kinds of companies to broaden their scope and to help them become they were a very narrow company. We wanted to help them become a healthier company in a lot of ways. So another fellow and I were hired to buy companies that would complement what they already did. We bought a bunch of companies. One of them was in Connecticut, and it was it was kind of sick at the time. And in fact, the more we looked at it, the sicker we realized it was. So the chairman of the company said, essentially, you bought it, you fix it. So my family and I moved out to Connecticut. And that was a great experience to live on the East Coast, because I grew up on the West Coast. And we were there for about 2 years and doing a fix-up job on this company. We fixed it up a bit, and enough that someone else wanted to buy it from us, and we were very glad to sell it. And then that allowed us to come back to the West Coast.
Yeah.
And that's when I got involved with Microsoft.
Okay. And then you got hired into Microsoft by Bill Gates.
Steve Ballmer was my boss, and Steve is now the president and CEO of Microsoft. And Steve and I had gone to graduate school at Stanford together, so we've known each other for eons. And then Bill Gates and I have known each other for a very long time, because in the early days of the Macintosh, we partnered with Microsoft on a lot of the early software development for the Macintosh. And Bill would come down to Cupertino, California, where Apple was headquartered, for meetings, and the meetings would have 4 or 5 people in it. It would be Bill and Steve Jobs and a few technical people, and I'd be there, and we'd be going over the details of the work that we'd be doing. So, and that was in those days, when way back then, Apple was the big company, and Microsoft was still quite small and not known by a lot of people.
Mm-hmm.
So it wasn't unusual that I would come to Microsoft. I think the unusual thing was the job that I ended up having initially was being a manager of one of the most technical areas of the company.
Mm-hmm.
And I am not one of the most technical people in that company at all. So it was a challenging job in terms of for me, in terms of being able to keep up with all the technical issues and knowing how to provide some guidance. But it was a good learning experience.
So how would you contrast the management styles of some of those people that... I know your management style. It'll be fun to talk about that in a minute, but how about you in those two environments?
Well, there's a lot of similarities that are generic, and that I think what I've learned from these experiences is that and as you study history of American businesses and the entrepreneurs in America, you'll find that a lot of companies that are household names, Ford Motor Company, General Electric, Disney, and now, let's say, Microsoft, Apple Computer in our generation, we all admire them because they're viewed as being highly entrepreneurial, innovative. They've created many, many jobs for people. They've brought good products and services into our lives. For a lot of us, we think that we couldn't live without them. So we assume that these companies are run by people who we might feel are like us, meaning even-keeled, level-headed. And everyone works on a steady pace, and they know what to do, and life goes on. And when you're in the middle of the battle, you realize it's not like that at all. What you do have in these kind of companies typically is one or two people at the top, and they're usually the founders, who seem to be maniacally driven towards some goal that is just so incredibly important to them that they have to get there no matter what. And that goal, and can be being the leader in their business, it can be becoming one of the richest men in the world, it can be being the first to innovate with a certain kind of technology, it can be technology or products for the sake of products, because that just turns them on. But whatever it is, the generic slice here is that they have this driving passion that subsumes everything else and reprioritizes everything else, including their relationships with people, the way they deal with the other parts of their life, and so forth. And you might say, well, that's not very attractive, is it? I'm not here to tell you, I'm not here to make any judgments on that at all. What I can report on is that if we enjoy these large companies, or these companies that have created value for America, well, it's hard to imagine how we could have ended up there if we would have had regular people at the helm. It takes tremendous sacrifice. It's a very hard thing, starting up a company, running a company, and trying to break through the inertia that just exists in all the systems that we have around us. So you've got these characters, and they can often be extremely difficult to work with and for, but on the other hand, if you can't stand the heat, you got to get out of the kitchen. So I've been fortunate to spend a lot of the time in the kitchen over the last 20 years with some very interesting people, and watching how they just had this drive that just compels them to push forward with an amazing strength and with a great passion and sense of urgency.
And you, I guess one of my favorite memories of your management style was it was a break during the meeting we had at Apple. We were on the beach and we're playing, and you were running out for a pass, and I was guarding you, and you jumped into my arms so that the man could go by or something. I thought that was an innovative strategy.
Well, I probably have a number of faults. And one of them is it's hard for me to take a lot of things too seriously. Yeah. And it's easy to find humor in almost any situation. So I don't have that winner-takes-all drive that some of the people I've associated with have. I appreciate what they have, but yeah. I just can't hold on to it that long. I'm also, I think, and it's genetic, or it's just personality, or it's choice, or my own refinement in terms of my life. I think I'm much more of a humanist. And I think I just truly care a lot more for the person than I do for the ultimate last 3 points of market share that we might get. It's easy for me when I've been in management situations to recognize the faults and weaknesses of a person who's working for me or somebody in my organization, and I'd rather try to help repair that person and help that person become a better person than fire them and bring in some other person who's obviously better, stronger, and can get us there in a shorter period of time. And that's a weakness that I have in a highly competitive environment where the end result is all that counts.
And it's interesting you say that the end result is all that counts in that industry, is sort of what you're saying.
I think in that industry, and I think in many industries, unfortunately, as we find ourselves competing at greater and greater scale, the stakes are very, very high. You could say, let's take our foot off the gas pedal a little bit and be a little gentler in the way we treat people. Well, it's a zero-sum game. If you choose to do that running your company, and you and I are competing against each other, But I don't do that in my company. I eat your lunch. And people might vote you as boss of the year, and might give you a nice trophy, and they might love you a lot more, but they're all going to be unemployed because I'm going to eat your lunch. So it's a very complicated problem, and it's one that kindness and values and character and so forth can't persuade an entire society or an entire economic system to change its ways. I think there may be something inherent in the free market system, which has brought great blessings to our nation and now to our world. There is perhaps a dark side to that as companies get larger, as economies become more global, as things get more accelerated, and as the world gets smaller through the internet and through technology, we find that the pace of competition only quickens. And it's hard to imagine, looking out 10, 20, 30, 40 years, anything but an acceleration of this trend that we see.
Interesting. So you were characterizing yourself, your kindness and your orientation toward being a humanist, as being a weakness.
In that sort of system, I think it is, because of the winner-takes-all nature of a free market system. And now I'm not talking about the local shopkeeper who's able to sell his or her goods on Main Street or in a village or something, and is able to somehow isolate himself from these large organizations that are all trying to create similar products. If you've got a car company and another guy's got a car company, and you can make your cars better, faster, cheaper than the other guy, you win. You win. Same thing with computers. If you can make your computer better, faster, cheaper than the other guy, you win. And why? Because the consumer at the other end of this long supply chain takes a look at these two computers and they look identical, but mine is $300 cheaper than yours, and the marketing's good and everything, the support looks good, they'll end up buying mine. So it's a somewhat almost predictable cycle that I think that we're in when you, a new word someone taught me, when you massify or make large these organizations, and by their very nature they're going to get larger and larger. And there will continue to be consolidation of generic industries as people strive to figure out how can I lower costs and how can I gain more revenue and increase my profits. And I'm not casting any evil dispersions on the people running these companies. I think they are as much victims in the system that we have as anybody else. And they are trained to optimize this interesting set of algebraic equations of lower costs, increase revenue, get more profit, deliver more earnings per share to the shareholders, and they win.
Yeah. So you're professing a view that's very similar to what we've talked about before, I guess, and that is that the system is right now in a problem state, or there's a problematic aspect to it here in this competition.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is the system is doing what it's supposed to do. It's just never gotten this large before. It's never gotten this global before, as we've been able to reduce the barriers of time and geography and cultures through technology, through airplane travel, through telecommunications. We do have this global market that we're living in. The world has shrunk. And so it has exacerbated many of the inherent weaknesses of a free market system. I don't have a better solution. I certainly don't believe, in terms of my philosophy, that governments can do this any better. And if you really truly study what's happened in the Soviet Union over the last 40, 50 years, there's ample evidence there that governments completely mess up the lives of people. They take away their ability to choose. They take away their moral agency. And these people are unable now to recover and know how to be self-sufficient. So
now you've left. Now you're not in Microsoft anymore. You've left Microsoft, and so how are you? It sounds like you're working toward dealing with some of these problems.
Well, I left Microsoft about a little over a year ago, and I'm taking a whole new focus in my life now. I've been very fortunate to have many very rich experiences at an early stage of a typical career, if you will. And I feel a sense of true obligation to use those lessons and experiences to now see if I can't go out and do some good in the world. I've also been blessed financially, which was a serendipitous thing. Who knew that would have happened, and it has. But I also feel a real sense of moral responsibility to do something with that as well. So I'm going to be spending the rest of my life doing good, and what that means to me is helping those who can't get up in the world because of the system they may have been born under. Maybe they're in a third world country that's been run by dictators or whatever. Maybe they were born in a situation here in America where both the parents are drug addicts. There's a bunch of people who can have simply outstanding lives if they're given an opportunity. And that's what we look for in the work that I'm doing now, is creating programs and supporting existing programs that help lift people up so they can become whole and successful humans and have great lives. Great lives in the sense of being able to contribute, being able to love, being able to help, being able to grow and support the communities that they live in, wherever they are.
So it sounds like you've outlined a problem, and it sounds like your efforts, though, are really sort of in a different area.
My efforts right, yes, thanks. My efforts right now are one person, along with my wife, and some work that we do. And when you try to work on this gigantic global macroeconomic problem, I could spend 40, 50 years on that and maybe make this much difference. But if instead I can spend the next 40, 50 years dealing at an individual level and helping 500 people, 1,000 people, 5,000 people have a better life, then I've done something.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's a choice that I've made, is to scale down and see if I can't make an impact in individuals' lives, and then hopefully that will have a multiplying effect, that these 5,000 people will be able to then affect 20,000 people in their areas, and goodness will be had.
Good. Just got a little bit of time, but I wondered how are you doing that specifically, or what's the way in which that's happening?
Well, there's several different projects that we've funded ourselves. One is the creation of a new organization called Unitus, which literally means uniting us together. And it's an organization of people who are we've created a website called unitus.com, and the purpose of the website is to connect those people who would like to be involved in poverty-fighting projects around the world with existing organizations that are already fighting poverty. So let's say you've always been interested in doing something in Peru because you knew someone who lived there, or you lived there when you were in college or whatever. Here's a chance to go to our website, find out 4 or 5 projects that are already going on in Peru that are providing small microeconomic loans or other type of economic development packages to local villagers at an individual level in a remote village in Peru, and you can donate small amounts of money, $100, $200, to these projects via our website. If you want, you can go and visit them in the summertime, but you will know that you're actually helping lift somebody out of poverty and becoming self-sufficient and a productive member of their community. So the purpose of Unitus, this organization, is to mobilize and catalyze this effort, which we hope will become a very large effort in a number of years, with at least 1 million people participating in this. Another program in a totally different area is that of helping inner city children in Seattle who come from the very worst economic backgrounds get a shot at having a better life by providing them with a full-time mentor after school, a person who provides a moral compass, some training, some tutoring, a friend in the evening, a friend on weekends. And this program is modeled after a program in Portland, and it's called Friends of the Children. So we funded that program in Seattle. We've got our first 2 mentors, we were called Friends, in Thurgood Marshall School in Seattle, and they'll be working with first graders who come from very unfortunate backgrounds. And this program in Portland now, which is going on for 8 years, has had tremendous success in preventing these kids from falling into the gutter of life, and instead they become outstanding students and really do a great job.
Sounds super. Sounds super. I think we've reached the end of our period of time, and Mike and I are going to continue a little bit longer. But at this point, we'll leave you. Thanks a lot, Mike, for...
Well, thanks for the opportunity. It's great to see you again.
Yeah, for being here. Good. Okay.